Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you could count on, leaving you with nothing but the choice between pride and survival. For Clara Bennett, that moment came on a frozen December morning in 1887, when she lost both her teaching job and her room at the boarding house in the same cruel hour. Standing on the porch of the richest ranch in Montana, with her last few coins in her pocket, the 26-year-old schoolteacher never imagined what rancher James Whitmore would offer her. He needed a mother for his two young sons. She needed shelter from the coming storm. His proposal was simple: marriage for survival, not love. But as Clara looked into the eyes of two motherless boys and felt the first snowflakes of what would become the worst blizzard in decades, she realized this arrangement might cost her heart in ways she never expected. What happens when a practical marriage becomes something neither of them planned for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Bennett clutched her worn leather satchel closer to her chest as the wind whipped across the Montana plains, carrying with it the promise of the worst storm anyone had seen in years. Inside that satchel lay everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, a few undergarments, her mother's silver brush, and the teaching certificate that had once meant everything to her future. She had come west 3 years ago with dreams as vast as the territory itself. The daughter of a Philadelphia banker who had lost everything in a series of bad investments, Clara had watched her comfortable world crumble overnight. Her engagement to Thomas Hartwell, a promising young lawyer, had dissolved the moment her father's fortune disappeared. "I cannot marry a woman without prospects," Thomas had said, as if Clara herself had become worthless the instant her dowry vanished. The teaching position in Cedar Ridge had been her salvation then, a chance to start over where no one knew about her family's disgrace. She had thrown herself into educating the frontier children, finding purpose in their eager faces and small victories. But Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the boarding house where Clara lived, had made it clear from the beginning that a single woman of 26 was an oddity that made the other residents uncomfortable. "It's not natural," Mrs. Abernathy had said that morning, her pinched face showing no sympathy as she delivered the blow. "A woman your age should be married with children of her own, not filling young minds with notions above their station. The school board agrees. They want someone younger, someone who won't be giving the older boys inappropriate ideas." The unfairness of it burned in Clara's chest. She had done nothing wrong except age beyond what society deemed acceptable for an unmarried woman. At 26, she was considered a spinster, too old for marriage prospects, but apparently too dangerous to teach young men only a few years her junior. "And I'll need your room by tonight," Mrs. Abernathy had continued, not even having the grace to look ashamed. "I have a new tenant coming, a married couple, more respectable, you understand." So here Clara stood, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter air, facing the imposing log and stone ranch house that belonged to James Whitmore. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about the wealthy rancher who had lost his wife in childbirth 5 years ago, leaving him to raise 2 young sons alone. His cattle operation was the largest in 3 counties, his house grand enough to make the territorial governor envious. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a man who commanded attention without trying. James Whitmore stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad from years of physical labor, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, despite his 34 years. His blue eyes held a weariness that spoke of losses too deep for words, and when he looked at Clara, she saw a flash of something recognition, perhaps of one soul adrift recognizing another. "Miss Bennett," he said in a voice roughened by years of calling orders across vast distances. "Heard you might be looking for work." "Yes, sir." Clara straightened her spine, determined not to let desperation show. "I can cook, clean, teach children. I'm not afraid of hard work." James studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn but clean dress, the proud set of her shoulders, despite her obvious circumstances. Behind him, Clara could see the warm glow of lamplight and hear the sound of children's voices. Her heart ached with longing for the home she had never truly had. "Come in out of the cold," he said finally, stepping aside. "We need to talk." The interior of the house was more beautiful than Clara had imagined. Rich wood paneling lined the walls, and a massive stone fireplace dominated the main room. Comfortable furniture spoke of a woman's touch, though dust had settled on surfaces that Clara suspected had once been lovingly tended. It was the home of a man trying to raise children alone, successful in providing material comfort, but struggling with the softer touches that made a house truly alive. Two boys peered at her from the staircase, one dark-haired like his father, the other fair with his mother's coloring, if the portrait on the mantel was any indication. The older boy, whom she guessed to be around 8, watched her with suspicious eyes. The younger one, perhaps 5, seemed merely curious. "Tommy, Sam, come down here," James called to his sons. "This is Miss Bennet." The boys approached with the cautious politeness of children who had learned not to expect permanence from the adults in their lives. Clara's heart went out to them immediately. She had seen that wariness before, in her own reflection during the worst days after her father's financial ruin. "How do you do?" she said gently, not trying to force familiarity they weren't ready for. "Fine, thank you," Tommy replied with mechanical courtesy, while Sam hung back behind his older brother. James gestured toward the sofa. "Sit down, Miss Bennet. Can I get you coffee? You look half frozen." The warmth of the house was making Clara realize how cold she had been, how long she had been fighting despair. "Coffee would be very kind, thank you." As James busied himself with the pot that had been warming by the fire, Clara looked around the room more carefully. She could see the struggles of a man trying to create a home for his children. Toys were scattered about, but there was no organization to them. The boys' clothes were clean but wrinkled, well made but showing signs of hasty mending. This was a house that needed a woman's touch, not just for cleaning and cooking, but for the 100 small ways a mother makes a family feel secure. "I'll be direct with you, Miss Bennet," James said as he handed her a steaming cup. "I know your situation. Word travels fast in a town this size. I also know you're a good woman, educated, respectable. My boys need more than I can give them." Clara sipped the coffee, letting its warmth steady her nerves. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Whitmore?" "Marriage," he said simply, the word falling between them like a stone into still water. "Not love, not romance. A practical arrangement. You need security and a home. I need a mother for my sons and a woman to help run this household. We could help each other." The directness of it took Clara's breath away. She had expected an offer of employment, perhaps as a housekeeper or governess. Marriage had not entered her thoughts, even to a man as substantial as James Whitmore. "I don't understand," she said carefully. James set down his coffee and looked at her with those weary blue eyes. "My first wife, Elizabeth, died giving birth to Sam. For 5 years, I've tried to be everything these boys need, but I can't be their mother. I can't give them the soft comfort a woman provides, can't teach them the things a mother would. They need stability, need to know someone will be here for them, always." He paused, looking toward his sons, who had retreated to play near the window, though Clara suspected they were listening to every word. "As for you, Miss Bennet, I know what it means to be alone in the world with no prospects. You're too proud to become anyone's charity case, too intelligent to waste your talents on menial labor. This arrangement would give you respect, security, a place in the community. In return, you'd give my sons what I cannot a mother's care." The boys glanced over at the mention of the word mother, and Clara saw the hunger in their young faces, the desperate hope they were trying so hard to hide. Her own heart clenched with recognition. She understood that particular brand of loneliness, the ache of wanting to belong somewhere, to someone. "And what about," Clara hesitated, heat rising in her cheeks, "what about the more personal aspects of marriage?" James's expression remained carefully neutral. "We would be married in name and before the law. You would have your own room, your privacy respected." This would be a partnership for the benefit of the children and our mutual security. Nothing more would be expected unless— He stopped himself, as if he had been about to say something he thought better of. Unless, Clara prompted. Unless we both came to want something different, he finished quietly. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and reminding Clara of her dire circumstances. She had nowhere to go, no money for train fare, even if she had somewhere to travel to. Winter was closing in, and she had seen too many women disappear into the harsh realities of frontier life when they had no protection, no family, no options. But this marriage to a stranger, becoming an instant mother to two grieving children, living a lie for the sake of survival, it seemed impossible. And yet, as she looked at Tommy and Sam, she saw herself in their carefully guarded expressions. They were all of them refugees from loss, searching for something to hold on to. "I would need time to think," Clara said finally. James nodded, but his eyes moved to the window where the snow was beginning to fall in earnest. "Of course, though I'm afraid the storm may make that time shorter than we'd like. The roads will be impassable within hours." As if summoned by his words, a fierce gust of wind shook the house, and the snow began falling harder. Clara realized she was truly trapped now, her last bridge burned behind her. She looked at the man across from her, this stranger who had offered her salvation in a form she had never imagined, and wondered if desperation was enough foundation for the kind of life he was proposing. In the portrait above the mantel, Elizabeth Whitmore smiled down at them with painted serenity, her beauty preserved forever in oils and canvas. Clara wondered what that woman would think of her husband's practical proposal, of another woman stepping into her life, her role, her home. The wind continued to rise outside, and Clara realized that whatever choice she made, there would be no going back. The storm was closing in, and with it, a future she had never planned but might have no choice but to embrace. By evening, the blizzard had transformed the Montana landscape into an impenetrable wall of white. Clara stood at the window of the guest room where James had installed her, watching the snow pile against the glass with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. The storm had made her decision for her. There was no possibility of leaving now, even if she had somewhere to go. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Bennet?" James's voice was carefully respectful. "Supper's ready, if you'd care to join us." The meal was a quiet affair, the boys stealing curious glances at Clara while trying to maintain the table manners their father had obviously worked hard to instill. The food was simple but well prepared. James clearly had some domestic skills, though Clara could see the strain of managing everything alone in the slight burn on the bread. The overcooked vegetables that spoke of a man's attention divided between too many tasks. "Papa," Sam said suddenly, his young voice breaking the careful politeness, "is Miss Bennet going to stay?" James's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "That depends on Miss Bennet, son." Clara felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on her, each carrying different hopes and fears. Tommy's expression remained guarded, as if he had learned not to trust that good things might last. Sam's face showed open curiosity, mixed with a child's desperate need for maternal warmth. James watched her with the careful neutrality of a man who had made his offer and would not pressure her for an answer, though she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "The storm seems quite severe," Clara said carefully. "I may need to stay longer than originally planned." It was not an answer exactly, but Sam brightened considerably while Tommy continued to study her with those 2 old eyes. After supper, James suggested the boys show Clara around the house. It was clearly a diversionary tactic, a way to give her more time to consider his proposal while allowing the children to become accustomed to her presence. Clara found herself grateful for his consideration. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, with 6 bedrooms upstairs and several additional rooms on the main floor. Elizabeth Whitmore's touch was evident everywhere in the careful placement of furniture, the warm colors of the curtains and rugs, the way every room felt designed for family life rather than mere function. "This was Mama's sewing room," Sam said, pushing open a door to reveal a sun-filled space with a beautiful wooden cabinet filled with threads and fabrics. Papa keeps it just like she left it. Clara's heart clenched at the reverence in the child's voice. The room was preserved like a shrine, dust sheets covering the chair where Elizabeth had once sat, her work basket still holding an unfinished piece of embroidery. It was clear that James had not been able to bring himself to change anything, as if altering the space might somehow diminish his wife's memory. "She was making that for me," Tommy said quietly, pointing to the embroidery. "A shirt for my birthday. Papa said maybe someday we'd find someone who could finish it." The weight of expectation in his words was almost unbearable. Clara realized that in the children's minds, her presence here was already taking on significance far beyond what she had intended. They were beginning to hope, and hope was a dangerous thing for children who had already lost so much. "Your mother had beautiful needlework," Clara said gently. "She must have loved you very much to take such care with your gift." Tommy nodded solemnly, then surprised her by taking her hand. "Would you like to see our rooms?" The boys' bedrooms were side by side, connected by a door that was obviously left open at night. Tommy's room showed the tidiness of a child trying to be grown up, while Sam's bore the cheerful chaos of a 5-year-old. Both rooms had the slightly neglected air of spaces tended by a father who tried his best but lacked a woman's intuitive understanding of what children needed. "Papa reads to us sometimes," Sam offered, "but he falls asleep in the chair. He gets very tired." Clara could imagine it James working from dawn to dusk, managing the ranch, then coming home to cook dinner, help with washing, try to fill the role of both parents. The exhaustion must be overwhelming, the responsibility crushing for a man grieving his own losses while trying to shelter his children from theirs. When they returned downstairs, James was in his study, working on ledgers by lamplight. He looked up as they entered, and Clara saw the question in his eyes. "Boys, time for bed," he said. "Say good night to Miss Bennet." Sam approached her shyly, and to her surprise, stood on his tiptoes, clearly wanting something. Clara knelt down to his level, and he whispered in her ear, "Will you still be here in the morning?" The trust in his voice nearly broke her heart. "Yes," she heard herself saying. "I'll be here in the morning." Tommy hung back, still wary, but he managed a polite good night before following his brother upstairs. Clara could hear James's footsteps overhead as he tucked them in, the low murmur of his voice reading a bedtime story. When he returned, he found Clara standing before the fireplace, staring into the flames. "They're good boys," she said without turning around. "They are, but they need more than I can give them." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell the scent of wood, smoke and leather that seemed to cling to him. "They need a mother." Clara turned to face him, studying the lines of weariness around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried the weight of responsibility for everything and everyone in his care. "Mr. Whitmore James, what you're proposing, it's not really a marriage, it's a business arrangement." "Does that matter?" he asked quietly. "If it gives us all what we need. And what if it doesn't work? What if the boys don't accept me, or if we find we cannot live together in harmony? What if you come to regret giving up the possibility of finding love again?" Something flickered in his eyes at her last question, gone too quickly for her to interpret. "Love is a luxury I can't afford to think about, Miss Bennet. My priorities are my sons and keeping this ranch running so they'll have something to inherit. As for the rest, we're both adults. Surely we can find a way to live together with mutual respect and courtesy." It was such a practical answer, so devoid of romance or even hope for happiness. Clara found herself wondering what he had been like before. Loss had taught him to settle for mere survival, before grief had convinced him that duty was enough to sustain a life. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and reminding them both that the storm had made her decision urgent. Clara thought of the boys upstairs, of their carefully hidden longing for maternal love. She thought of James, carrying burdens too heavy for any one person. She thought of herself, 26 years old with no prospects, no family, no future, except what she could make with her own hands. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "what would the arrangements be? How would we?" She paused, heat rising in her cheeks again. "How would we explain it to people?" We'd be married by Reverend Morrison as soon as the storm passes and the roads are clear enough for him to get here. As far as anyone else is concerned, we met, we fell in love, we married quickly because of the weather. Simple as that. And the more personal aspects, you mentioned separate rooms. You would have complete privacy. My bedroom is at the far end of the hall from the guest room. We would be married in name and law, but the relationship would be what we made of it. I would never force anything on you, Miss Bennet. You have my word on that. Clara nodded, though she couldn't help wondering what would happen if, over time, the artificial boundaries of their arrangement began to feel constraining. What if proximity and shared purpose led to something neither of them had planned for? And if I wanted to leave, if this arrangement proved impossible? James was quiet for a long moment. I would not hold you against your will, but I would ask that you consider the boys before making any hasty decisions. They've had enough instability in their lives. The weight of responsibility settled on Clara's shoulders like a mantle. She would not just be agreeing to marry James Whitmore-ish, would be agreeing to become a mother to 2 children who desperately needed one, to step into a dead woman's life and try to make it her own. I need to think, she said. James nodded. Of course. But Miss Bennet Clareth, Reverend, will need to come soon after the storm breaks. The longer we delay, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the fiction that this is a love match. Clara understood. In a small community like Cedar Ridge, people would already be speculating about her presence at the Whitmore ranch during the blizzard. The longer she stayed unmarried under his roof, the more her reputation would suffer, and with it, any possibility of this arrangement working. I understand. James moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I believe you would be good for the boys. They've taken to you already, and that's not something that happens easily. They've learned to be cautious with their affections. After he left, Clara remained by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to imagine a future she had never planned. Upstairs, she could hear the house settling into nighttime quiet, the boys safe in their beds, James probably still working by lamplight in his study. She thought of the marriage certificate that would bind her to this life, this man, these children, a piece of paper that would transform her from a desperate spinster into a wife and mother overnight. The very idea seemed impossible, yet here she was, seriously considering it. The fire burned lower, and Clara finally went upstairs to the guest room. As she prepared for bed, she could hear the storm raging outside, but inside the house there was warmth and safety and the possibility of belonging somewhere. For a woman who had spent years feeling like an outsider in her own life, the prospect was almost irresistibly appealing. She lay in the comfortable bed, listening to the wind and thinking about the boys' faces at supper, the way Sam had whispered his hopes in her ear, the way Tommy had taken her hand despite his wariness. She thought about James's weary strength, the way he carried his responsibilities without complaint, the careful respect with which he had made his proposal. By morning, Clara knew what her answer would be. The blizzard had given her shelter for the night, but James Whitmore was offering her something far more precious: a place to belong, a purpose, a family. Even if it wasn't love, even if it was just a practical arrangement between 2 lonely people, it was more than she had dared hope for when she had knocked on his door with her few coins and her worn leather satchel. The marriage certificate would be signed, and with it, Clara Bennet would cease to exist. In her place would be Clara Whitmore, wife and mother, a woman with a home and family and future. The transformation might be built on necessity rather than love, but sometimes, Clara thought as she drifted off to sleep, necessity was the strongest foundation of all. The ceremony took place on a crisp morning 3 days after the storm had passed, in the front parlor of the Whitmore house, with Reverend Morrison presiding. Clara wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and James had somehow procured a small bouquet of winter greenery that smelled of pine and promise. The Reverend, a kindly man in his 60s who had known James since boyhood, performed the service with gentle dignity, asking no uncomfortable questions about the hasty nature of their union. Tommy and Sam stood beside their father, freshly scrubbed and wearing their Sunday best, watching the proceedings with the intense focus of children who understood they were witnessing something that would change their lives forever. "Do you, James Edward Whitmore, take Clara Ann Bennett to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Morrison's voice filled the quiet room. "I do." James's response was firm, his eyes meeting Clara's with reassuring steadiness. "And do you, Clara Ann Bennett, take James Edward Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara's throat felt tight as she looked at this man who was offering her salvation in such an unexpected form. "I do." When James slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, his grandmother's ring, he had explained that morning Clara felt the weight of it settle against her skin like a promise she wasn't sure either of them could keep. The ring was slightly too large, but it would do until they could have it properly sized. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Morrison said with a gentle smile. The moment stretched between them, weighted with the awkwardness of their arrangement. James leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly to Clara's cheek, a chaste kiss that spoke of respect rather than passion. But as he pulled away, their eyes met, and Clara saw something flicker their awareness, perhaps of the woman he had just bound himself to, or maybe just surprise at the warmth of even that simple contact. "Congratulations, Mrs. Whitmore," the Reverend said, and Clara felt a shock run through her at the name. Mrs. Whitmore. She was married. She belonged somewhere. Sam immediately ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her waist. "Mama," he said, the word bursting out of him as if he had been holding it back for days. Tommy hung back, but his eyes showed a cautious hope that hadn't been there before the ceremony. Clara knelt down and opened her arms to both boys. "Come here," she said softly, and after a moment's hesitation, Tommy joined his brother. As she held the two children, Clara caught James watching them with an expression of profound relief. For the first time since she had arrived, some of the tension seemed to ease from his shoulders. After Reverend Morrison left, declining their invitation to stay for the wedding breakfast Clara had prepared, the new family found themselves alone together, suddenly uncertain of how to proceed. The legal formalities were complete, but the emotional adjustment was just beginning. "Well," James said, clearing his throat, "I suppose we should discuss how we'll manage things." They gathered in the kitchen while Clara served coffee and the biscuits she had made that morning. The domestic scene felt both natural and strangish, was playing house with people who were essentially strangers, yet the boys' faces showed such contentment at having a woman bustling around the kitchen that Clara felt her heart expand with unexpected tenderness. "I'll need to understand the household routines," Clara said practically. "What time the boys usually eat when they go to bed, what chores they're expected to do." "Tommy helps with the chickens," James said. "Sam's still a bit young for regular chores, but he likes to help with simple tasks. They usually eat supper around 6, earlier in winter when the days are short." Tommy looked up from his biscuit. "Are you going to make us mind our manners like Mrs. Patterson did?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Patterson?" "The housekeeper we had for a while," James explained. "She was very strict about deportment. She made us sit up straight and wouldn't let us talk at meals," Sam added with a slight shudder. Clara smiled. "I believe children should have good manners, but I also believe meals should be pleasant. There's no point in having a family supper if no one can enjoy it." The relief on both boys' faces was evident, and Clara saw James's mouth quirk up slightly at the corners. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and far more approachable. "What about school?" Clara asked. "I know the schoolhouse is closed for now, but they'll need their education." "I've been teaching them some," James said. "Reading, arithmetic, a bit of history, but I know it's not enough." "I could help with that," Clara offered. "It was my profession after all." Tommy looked interested for the first time since the ceremony. "You were really a teacher?" "For 3 years. I taught children from 6 to 16 in a one-room schoolhouse." "Could you teach us about other places?" Sam asked eagerly. "Papa showed us maps, but he doesn't know much about cities and things." Clara felt a spark of the old enthusiasm she had always found in teaching. "I'd be happy to. We could start this afternoon if you'd like." The boys exchanged excited glances, and Clara realized she had found her first real foothold in their affections. Children were always drawn to adults who could open new worlds for them, and education was something she could offer that their father, for all his other virtues, could not provide as well. After breakfast, James excused himself to attend to ranch business, leaving Clara alone with her new stepsons. The awkwardness she had expected didn't materialize. Instead, the boys seemed eager to show her their treasures, their favorite books, the drawings Tommy had made of various animals he'd seen around the ranch. It was while looking through Tommy's collection of sketches that Clara found the pictures that made her breath catch. Hidden beneath drawings of horses and cattle were several portraits, clearly drawn from memory, of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "This is your mother," Clara said softly, not making it a question. Tommy nodded, his face suddenly guarded again. "I draw her so I won't forget what she looked like." Clara's heart ached for this child, who felt he had to preserve his mother's memory through his own 8-year-old hands. "She was very beautiful. You've captured her perfectly." "Do you think—" Tommy stopped, biting his lip. "What is it, sweetheart? Do you think it's wrong for us to like you? I mean, when we still miss Mama?" The question hit Clara with unexpected force. She sat down on Tommy's bed and pulled him close, Sam automatically climbing up to join them. "Oh, my dear boy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Loving your mother and missing her is exactly what you should do. She was your first mother, and nothing will ever change that. I'm not here to replace her or make you forget her. I'm here because she can't be, and I hope she would want you to have someone to take care of you and love you." Tommy leaned against her, some of the tension leaving his small body. "Papa says she would have wanted us to be happy." "I'm sure she would, and being happy doesn't mean forgetting her. It means honoring her memory by living the kind of life she would have wanted for you." Sam, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Will you read to us like Mama used to?" "I'd love to," Clara said. "What were her favorite stories to share with you?" The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of stories and games, the boys gradually relaxing in her presence as she proved herself to be neither the strict disciplinarian Mrs. Bull Patterson had been nor a replacement trying to erase their mother's memory. By the time James returned from his work, Clara had established the beginnings of a routine that felt natural rather than forced. "How did your first day go?" James asked, when they had a moment alone after supper. "Better than I expected," Clara admitted. "They're wonderful children, James. You've done a good job with them." Something in his expression softened at her use of his first name. "They seem happier already. Sam hasn't stopped chattering about the geography lesson you gave them. Teaching is what I know best. I'm glad I can contribute something useful." James studied her face in the lamplight. "You're being very kind to them. I appreciate it. They're easy to be kind to. They just need to know they're safe, that someone will be here for them consistently." "And what about you?" James asked quietly. "Do you feel safe here?" The question surprised her with its insight. "I do," she said, realizing it was true. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a place where I belong." James nodded, looking pleased. "Good. That's what I hoped for." As Clara prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She was no longer Clara Bennett, the desperate spinster with nowhere to go. She was Clara Whitmore, wife and mother, with a home and family that needed her. The transformation felt surreal, but also strangely right. The boys had kissed her goodnight with increasing naturalness, and even Tommy had seemed to relax his guard. James had been unfailingly courteous, maintaining the respectful distance they had agreed upon, while showing genuine appreciation for her efforts with his sons. It wasn't love, this arrangement they had made, but it was something valuable, nonetheless a partnership built on mutual need and growing respect. As Clara settled into sleep in her comfortable room, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps, in time, it might grow into something even more precious. For now, it was enough that she was no longer alone, that she had found a place where she was wanted and needed. The marriage certificate lay in the desk drawer downstairs, a legal document that had changed everything. But the real transformation was happening in the daily moments of family life, in the gradual building of trust and affection that no piece of paper could mandate. Clara fell asleep thinking that maybe, just maybe, she had found her way home after all. 2 weeks into their marriage, Clara discovered her first real challenge as the new Mrs. Whitmore. She had been organizing the boys' belongings when she found Tommy's most treasured possessions hidden under his mattress, not just the drawings of his mother, but also a small wooden horse, a pressed flower, and a lock of golden hair tied with a blue ribbon. The sight of these carefully preserved mementos broke her heart, even as it helped her understand the depth of the child's grief. Tommy had created his own private shrine to his mother, keeping her memory alive in the only way an 8-year-old knew how. "Tommy," she called softly when she heard him coming up the stairs. "Could you come here for a moment?" He appeared in the doorway, took one look at the items spread on his bed, and his face went white. "You weren't supposed to find those," he whispered, his voice thick with shame and panic. "Oh, sweetheart," Clara said, kneeling down to his level. "Why would you hide these beautiful things? They're part of your mother, part of your memories of her." Tommy's lower lip trembled. "Mrs. Patterson said it wasn't healthy to keep dwelling on Mama. She said I needed to put away childish things and act like a man. Papa told her she was wrong, but—" His voice broke completely. Clara felt a surge of anger at the thoughtless woman who had tried to force a grieving child to abandon his mother's memory. She gathered Tommy into her arms, holding him as he finally let the tears come. "Mrs. Patterson was very wrong," Clara said firmly. "These things are precious because they help you remember someone you love. There's nothing childish about that. Even grown-ups keep special things to remember people who are important to them." "Really?" Tommy's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "Really? In fact, I think these treasures deserve a better place than under your mattress. Would you like to help me make a special box for them, something beautiful that honors your mother's memory?" Tommy pulled back to look at her, hope flickering in his tear-stained eyes. "You would do that? I would be honored to help you make a memory box for your mother. And Tommy, you never have to hide your love for her from me. She was your first mother, and she always will be. I'm just grateful she raised such a wonderful son." That afternoon, while Sam napped and James worked in the barn, Clara and Tommy went through Elizabeth's sewing room together. Clara had been hesitant to disturb the space, but Tommy's need was more important than preserving a shrine to the past. "Papa keeps everything just like she left it," Tommy said as they entered the sun-filled room. "He says someday we might want to remember how she kept things." Clara could see the wisdom in James's approach, but she also saw the problem. The room had become a museum rather than a living part of the house, a place to visit rather than a space that could offer comfort. "What if we made it a place where you could come to remember her, but also where you could do things she would have enjoyed?" Clara suggested gently. "She was a seamstress, wasn't she? Maybe you'd like to learn some of her skills." Tommy's eyes lit up. "Could you teach me? Mama was making me a shirt, but it's not finished." Clara's breath caught as she saw the unfinished embroidery in Elizabeth's work, Basquetta child's shirt, with intricate stitching around the collar and cuffs. The work was exquisite, each stitch placed with loving care. "I could try to finish it for you," Clara offered, "though I should warn you, my needlework isn't nearly as fine as your mother's." "Would you really?" Tommy's face was transformed with joy. "I've wanted to wear it for so long, but Papa doesn't know how to sew." As Clara examined the delicate work, she felt the weight of stepping into another woman's craft, another woman's love made manifest in thread and fabric. But she also felt the rightness of it. This was what Elizabeth would have wanted, for her son to have the gift she had been making for him. "We'll work on it together," Clara decided. "You can help me, and I'll tell you about the different stitches your mother was using. That way, you'll be part of finishing her gift to you." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the sewing room, Clara carefully working on the shirt, while Tommy sorted through his mother's buttons and threads, marveling at their colors and textures. As they worked, Tommy began to share stories about his mother, how she used to sing while she sewed, how she would let him help by holding the thread, how she had promised him the shirt would be ready for his birthday. She smelled like lavender, Tommy said dreamily. She had little bags of it in all her clothes. Sometimes I go to her room and open the wardrobe just to smell it. Clara's heart ached for this child, who was trying so hard to hold on to every sensory memory of his mother. "Would you like to make some lavender sachets?" she asked. "I could teach you how, and then you could have some in your own room." Tommy nodded eagerly, and Clara realized she had found a way to honor Elizabeth's memory while helping her son process his grief. They were not trying to replace his mother or forget her. They were finding ways to keep her love alive in practical, comforting ways. When James came in for supper that evening, he found Tommy wearing his mother's thimble and proudly displaying the progress they had made on the shirt. "Clara's helping me finish Mama's gift," Tommy announced. "And we're making a special box for my treasures, and she's going to teach me to make lavender bags like Mama used to have." James looked at Clara with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "That sounds like a wonderful project," he said carefully. "I hope you don't mind," Clara said when they had a moment alone. "I know the sewing room was kept as she left it." "No," James interrupted. I think this is what Elizabeth would have wanted. For the boys to have connection to her, but not to be trapped by grief." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know how to help Tommy with missing her. I was afraid if we talked about her too much, it would make the hurt worse. Sometimes talking about the hurt is the only way to heal it," Clara said gently. "Tommy needs to know it's safe to love his mother and miss her. Children can carry much more than we think, as long as they don't have to carry it alone." That night, after the boys were in bed, James found Clara in the kitchen finishing the mending. She looked up as he entered, noting the serious expression on his face. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for what you did with Tommy today. I've been worried about him, about how quiet he's been about Elizabeth. I thought maybe he was forgetting her, or trying to, and I didn't know if that was healthy or not." "He wasn't forgetting," Clara assured him. "He was protecting his memories because he thought they might be taken away from him. Children need permission to grieve, just like adults do." James sat down across from her, watching as she worked. "You're very wise about children. I've taught many of them over the years. You learn to read their hearts as well as their minds." Clara set down her sewing and looked at him directly. "James, I want you to know I'm not trying to erase Elizabeth's place in this family. I could never do that, and I wouldn't want to. The boys need their mother's memory to stay alive." "I know," James said quietly, "and I'm grateful. I was so focused on moving forward, on providing for them, that I forgot they needed to process the past too." "We can do both," Clara said. "Honor her memory and build new traditions. Help them heal while still keeping her love alive in their hearts." James nodded, and for the first time since she had arrived, Clara saw some of the deep weariness leave his eyes. They were finding their way as a family, learning to balance the past with the present, the old love with the new bonds they were forming. As Clara prepared for bed that night, she thought about the shirt she was finishing for Tommy, about the memory box they would make together, about the way Sam had begun calling her Mama with increasing naturalness, while Tommy was learning to trust her with his most precious treasures. She had her teaching supplies spread across the desk in her room books and papers, and the few personal items that had defined her old life. But increasingly, those seemed to belong to someone else, some other woman who had existed before she became part of this family. The Clara who was emerging in the Whitmore house was someone she was still getting to know, a woman who could honor the past while building something new, who could be strong enough to help others heal, even as she found her own wounded places beginning to mend. The transformation was happening slowly, day by day, stitch by stitch, as natural as breathing. And for the first time since her father's financial ruin had destroyed her old life, Clara began to believe that perhaps the best things in life weren't always the ones you planned, for sometimes they were the ones that found you when you were brave enough to say yes to an impossible proposition offered by a stranger. In the middle of a blizzard. Clara's first real test as Mrs. Whitmore came not from the boys or James, but from the community of Cedar Ridge itself. 3 weeks after the wedding, she accompanied James to Sunday services for the first time as his wife, wearing her best dress and the thin gold band that marked her new status. The moment they walked into the small wooden church, Clara felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. She had expected some interest after all. James Whitmore's sudden marriage was certainly news worth discussing, but she hadn't been prepared for the intensity of the scrutiny or the mixture of emotions she saw in the faces around her. Mrs. Abernathy, the boarding housekeeper who had evicted her, sniffed audibly as they passed her pew. "Some people certainly know how to land on their feet," she muttered to her companion, just loud enough for Clara to hear. James's hand tightened on Clara's elbow, his jaw setting in a way that suggested he had heard the comment too. But he kept walking, guiding her to the front pew that had always been reserved for the Whitmore family, Tommy and Sam following behind with the careful dignity they had learned from their father. As Reverend Morrison began the service, Clara tried to focus on the familiar words of the hymns and prayers, but she could feel eyes on her throughout, assessing and judging. She had become an object of speculation, and she realized that her acceptance into this community would not be automatic, despite her marriage to one of its most prominent members. After the service, the real challenge began. As they stood outside the church, several families approached to offer congratulations, but Clara could read the questions behind their polite smiles. How had a destitute schoolteacher managed to capture the heart of the territory's most eligible widower? What did she bring to the marriage besides her desperate circumstances? "Mrs. Whitmore," said Margaret Fairfax, the banker's wife, her tone carefully neutral, "how lovely to see you settling into married life so quickly. It must be quite an adjustment, taking on a ready-made family." The comment was designed to remind everyone present that Clara had married into her position rather than earning it through courtship and romance. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "The boys have been wonderful," she replied. "I feel very fortunate to have found such a loving family." "Indeed," Mrs. Fairfax continued with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "though I'm sure it must be difficult stepping into another woman's shoes. Elizabeth was so beloved in this community. We all wondered if James would ever find anyone who could measure up to her memory." The words hit their target perfectly, and Clara felt herself shrinking under their impact. Around them, other conversations quieted as people waited to see how she would respond to this not-so-subtle challenge. It was Tommy who came to her rescue. The 8-year-old stepped closer to Clara, his small hand slipping into hers with surprising firmness. "Mama, Clara is helping me finish the shirt my first mama was making for me," he announced proudly. "She says both my mamas loved me, and that's what makes me lucky." The simple statement, delivered with a child's absolute honesty, shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. Clara saw several faces soften, and Mrs. Fairfax's carefully constructed attack lost its power in the face of Tommy's obvious affection. "That's very sweet, dear," Mrs. Fairfax said weakly, clearly not having expected this turn. Sam, not to be outdone by his brother, piped up. "And she's teaching us about geography and science and lots of things Papa doesn't know about cities and such." James, who had been listening to the exchange with growing tension, finally spoke. "Clara has brought education and culture to our home that the boys wouldn't have had otherwise. We're all learning from her." There was something in his tone that discouraged further commentary, and the group gradually dispersed. But as they walked home, Clara could feel the weight of the encounter settling on her shoulders. "I'm sorry about that," James said quietly as they walked. "Margaret Fairfax has always been protective of Elizabeth's memory. She means well, but sometimes her loyalty goes too far." "Does the whole community feel that way?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "That I'm an inadequate replacement?" James stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Clara, you're not a replacement. You're yourself, with your own strengths and qualities. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth worrying about." But Clara did worry about it. Over the following days, she found herself second-guessing every decision, wondering how Elizabeth would have handled each situation. When she rearranged the kitchen to be more efficient, she worried she was erasing Elizabeth's systems. When she suggested new lessons for the boys, she wondered if she was overstepping her bounds as a stepmother rather than a natural mother. The pressure intensified when she discovered a family photograph tucked behind other papers in James's desk, a formal portrait of James, Elizabeth, and baby Tommy, all of them glowing with happiness and love. Elizabeth was even more beautiful than Clara had realized, with an ethereal quality that made Clara feel plain and earthbound by comparison. "You found the family portrait," James said, appearing in the doorway of his study. Clara started, not having heard him approach. "I'm sorry, I was looking for paper to write out the boys' lessons, and I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," James said, crossing to stand beside her. "You have every right to know about Elizabeth. She was a remarkable woman, beautiful, gentle, everything a man could want in a wife." The words, clearly meant to be respectful to his first wife's memory, hit Clara like physical blows. Everything a man could want in a wife. What did that make her? A practical compromise, a necessary arrangement, a poor substitute for what he had really wanted. "She was very beautiful," Clara managed to say. "Yes, she was. But Clara," James paused, seeming to struggle with his words, "beauty isn't the only quality that matters in a wife. Elizabeth was perfect for the man I was then, but she couldn't have done what you're doing now. She was delicate, refined. She wouldn't have been able to teach the boys advanced subjects or stand up to Margaret Fairfax or—" He stopped himself. "Or what?" Clara asked. "Or be strong enough to enter into a practical marriage with a widower and make it work for everyone involved. What you're doing takes a different kind of courage than Elizabeth ever needed." Clara looked down at the photograph again, studying Elizabeth's serene face. "Do you miss her very much?" The question hung between them, more personal than anything she had asked before. James was quiet for a long moment. "I miss the life we had," he said finally. "The certainty of it, the simplicity. But Clara, don't spend my days wishing things were different. What we have now, what we're building it, has its own value." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was more than Clara had dared hope for. She was beginning to understand that James was a man who measured his words carefully, who didn't make emotional declarations lightly. For him to acknowledge that their marriage had value was significant. That evening, as Clara tucked the boys into bed, Tommy looked up at her with his serious 8-year-old eyes. "Mama Clara, why was Mrs. Fairfax being mean to you at church?" Clara sat down on the edge of his bed, surprised by his perception. "She wasn't being mean exactly, sweetheart. She just loved your first mama very much, and she's worried about whether I can take good care of you and your papa and Sam." "But you do take good care of us," Sam said from his own bed. "You make good food, and you don't get mad when we're loud, and you're helping Tommy with his shirt." "Some people need time to see that," Clara explained. "They need to watch and learn before they trust someone new." Tommy considered this seriously. "Well, I think they're silly. You're the best mama we could have asked for." The simple statement, so matter-of-factly delivered, brought tears to Clara's eyes. She leaned down to kiss both boys goodnight, overwhelmed by the trust they had placed in her. As she prepared for bed that night, Clara looked at herself in the mirror with new eyes. She would never be Elizabeth Whitmore, with her ethereal beauty and perfect suitability to the role of rancher's wife. But she was Clara Whitmore now, with her own strengths and capabilities, her own way of loving this family that had become hers. The community might take time to accept her, but she had something more valuable than their immediate approval. She had the love and trust of 2 little boys and the growing respect of their father. She had found her place not by replacing someone else, but by being exactly who she was, a woman strong enough to take on an impossible situation and make it work through sheer determination and love. The family photograph would remain in the desk, a reminder of what had been. But Clara was beginning to understand that she wasn't competing with a ghost. She was building something entirely new, something that belonged to this moment and this version of their family. And perhaps, she thought as she settled into sleep, that was exactly as it should be. A month into their marriage, Clara found herself settling into the rhythms of ranch life, with surprising ease. The early spring brought new challenges and responsibilities, but also opportunities to prove herself beyond the drawing rooms and church pews, where she was still viewed with suspicion. It was on a crisp April morning that Clara discovered her mother's locket, which had been a constant presence around her neck since childhood, had somehow worked its way loose from its chain during the night. She found it on the floor beside her bed, the delicate gold surface scratched but intact. As she held the precious piece in her palm, memories flooded back her mother, fastening it around her neck on her 16th birthday, the weight of it against her throat during her teaching days, the comfort it had provided during the darkest moments after her father's financial ruin. Inside the locket were tiny portraits of her parents, the only images she had left of them. "What's that?" Sam asked, appearing in her doorway with the casual intrusion that had become natural between them. "It's a locket that belonged to my mother," Clara explained, opening it to show him the miniature portraits. "These are pictures of my parents, your new grandparents, I suppose." Sam studied the faces with intense curiosity. "They look nice. Are they in heaven like our first mama?" Clara nodded, touched by his simple acceptance of her family as part of his own. "Yes, they are. But they would have loved you and Tommy very much if they had met you." Tommy, drawn by their voices, joined them in examining the locket. "You never talk about them much," he observed with the directness that children possessed. "Sometimes it's hard to talk about people we miss," Clara said gently, "but maybe it's time I shared some stories about them with you." That afternoon, while James worked with the ranch hands to repair winter damage to the fences, Clara found herself in the kitchen with both boys, mixing bread dough and sharing memories of her childhood. She told them about her father's bank in Philadelphia, about the grand house where she had grown up, about her mother's garden parties and charity work. "Were you rich?" Sam asked, with the fascination children always showed for stories of wealth and grandeur. "We were comfortable," Clara said carefully. "We had a nice home and nice things, but we lost it all when some of Papa's investments went bad. That's why I became a teacher. I needed to support myself." "Is that why you came west?" Tommy asked. "Because you didn't have money anymore?" Clara nodded. "I thought I could make a new life here, away from all the people who knew about our troubles. And I was right. I did make a new life, just not the way I expected." As she kneaded the dough, Clara found herself sharing more than she had intended: the shame of her father's business failure, the cruel way her former friends had turned away from her family, the humiliation of Thomas Hartwell's broken engagement. The boys listened with the serious attention children gave to adult confessions, somehow understanding that these stories were important. "Mr. Hartwell sounds mean," Sam pronounced when she finished. "He wasn't mean exactly," Clara said, trying to be fair despite her own hurt. "He was just practical. He wanted to marry someone who could help his career, not someone who might hurt it." Tommy frowned. "Papa says that's not how real marriage works. He says people should marry because they want to take care of each other, not because of money or what other people think." The insight from her 8-year-old stepson surprised Clara. She wondered what conversations James had had with his boys about marriage, about the difference between love matches and practical arrangements. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion, outside shouting voices, and the sound of horses being ridden hard. Clara wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and went to the window, the boys crowding behind her. A group of riders was approaching the house at speed, and Clara could see that one of them was slumped over his horse's neck. As they drew closer, she recognized Jake Morrison, one of James's ranch hands, his shirt dark with blood. "Boys, stay here," Clara commanded, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. "Don't come outside until I tell you." She rushed out to meet the riders, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. James was already running from the barn, his face grim as he took in the scene. "What happened?" he demanded, as the men dismounted. "Rustlers," gasped Bill Hayes, the ranch foreman. "They hit the north pasture, made off with about 20 head. Jake tried to stop them and took a bullet in the shoulder." Clara found herself moving without conscious thought, her hands reaching to support Jake as he slid from his horse. The sight of blood didn't make her faint as she had always assumed it would. Instead, she felt a strange calm descend over her. "Get him inside," she ordered. "I'll need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey for the wound." "Clara, you don't have to," James started. "I've read about treating gunshot wounds," she said firmly. "And right now, I'm the closest thing to a doctor we have." For the next hour, Clara found herself in territory she had never imagined entering. With James holding Jake steady and the other men fetching supplies, she cleaned and bandaged the wound with hands that remained surprisingly steady. Jake had been lucky. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels. "You've got a steady hand, Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said weakly as she finished binding the wound. "Steadier than old Doc Peterson's, truth be told." Clara managed a shaky smile, only now beginning to feel the reaction from what she had just done. "I'm glad I could help." As the men settled Jake in the spare room to rest, James drew Clara aside. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I didn't really," Clara admitted. "I just read about battlefield medicine in some of the books Papa had about the war. I never thought I'd need to use it." James looked at her with something like amazement. "You probably saved his life. If we'd tried to get him to town with that wound, he might have bled to death on the way." Clara felt a strange surge of pride at his words. She had proven herself useful in a crisis, had shown courage and competence under pressure. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt like she truly belonged here. But the rustling incident brought new worries. That evening, after the boys were in bed, James explained the larger situation to Clara. "This isn't random," he said, his face grave in the lamplight. "Someone's been systematically hitting the smaller ranches, stealing just enough cattle to hurt, but not enough to ruin. They're testing our defenses, seeing how we respond. Do you know who's behind it?" James nodded grimly. "Marcus Webb. He's been trying to buy up land in this valley for months, making offers that are supposed to seem generous but are really threats. When people won't sell, he finds ways to make their lives difficult." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What does he want with your land?" "The railroad's coming through in the next few years. Webb knows which route they're planning to take, and he wants to control as much of the land along it as possible. He'll make a fortune selling right-of-way to the railroad and developing towns along the route." "And you won't sell to him?" James's expression hardened. "This land has been in my family for 2 generations. My father built this ranch from nothing, and I'll be damned if I'll let some eastern speculator steal it from my sons. Besides, if Webb gets control of this valley, he'll destroy everything that makes it worth having." Clara understood his position, but she also understood the danger they were now in. A man like Webb wouldn't be discouraged by one failed rustling attempt. He would escalate his efforts until James was forced to either sell or fight. "What can we do?" she asked. "We can be careful, we can be prepared, and we can hope that the other ranchers will stand together instead of selling out one by one." As Clara prepared for bed that night, she found herself looking at her mother's locket with new eyes. The people in those tiny portraits had faced their own struggles, their own losses. Her father had lost his fortune and his position in society, but he had never lost his dignity or his integrity. Her mother had faced social ruin with grace and quiet strength. Perhaps courage and resilience were in her blood after all. Perhaps the woman who had calmly treated a gunshot wound and was now ready to stand beside her husband against a dangerous enemy was who she had always been meant to be, if circumstances had just demanded it of her. The locket felt warm against her palm, a connection to the family that had shaped her and the strength they had passed down. She was no longer the helpless spinster who had arrived on James's doorstep in desperation. She was Clara Whitmore, wife and mother, a woman who could face whatever challenges came their way. And something told her that those challenges were only just beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, carried by a rider who refused to stay long enough for coffee or conversation. Clara recognized the expensive paper and careful penmanship immediately, even before she saw the Philadelphia postmark that made her hands tremble. James was out checking the cattle with the boys, a precaution he had instituted since the rustling incident. The house was quiet except for the sound of Clara's own breathing as she stared at the envelope that could only mean one thing: someone from her past had found her. With shaking fingers, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the cream-colored paper. The letterhead confirmed her worst fears. Hartwell, Associates, Attorneys at Law, Thomas's law firm. Her rejected fiancé had somehow tracked her down across a continent and half a decade. "My dear Clara," the letter began in Thomas's familiar, precise handwriting. "I trust this letter finds you in good health, despite the primitive conditions in which I understand you have been living. Word has reached Philadelphia of your recent marriage to a cattle rancher in the Montana Territory. While I confess myself surprised by your choice to marry so far beneath your upbringing and education, I write not to judge, but to offer you an opportunity for redemption. My circumstances have changed considerably since our last meeting. My law practice has prospered beyond our most optimistic projections, and my political connections have advanced to the point where a seat in Congress seems well within reach. Most significantly, my wife of 3 years has recently passed away from consumption, leaving me once again in need of a suitable companion. I am prepared to overlook the unfortunate circumstances that have led you to your current situation. Your marriage to this frontiersman can be quietly dissolved, and you can return to the civilized society where you belong. I am willing to welcome you back into my life and to provide you with the position in society that your breeding and education deserve. Our previous understanding can be renewed, with the benefit of maturity and experience on both our parts. I know you must feel trapped in your current circumstances, far from the refinements of proper society. This is your chance to reclaim the life that should have been yours. I have enclosed funds for your immediate travel expenses and have taken the liberty of making inquiries about the legal requirements for dissolving territorial marriages. Please respond with all haste. I am eager to welcome you home to your rightful place. Your devoted Thomas Hartwell. Clara sank into a chair, the letter falling from nerveless fingers to flutter to the kitchen floor. The audacity of it took her breath away. Thomas's assumption that she would be grateful for his condescending offer, his casual dismissal of her marriage as something to be quietly dissolved, his complete inability to imagine that she might actually be happy with the life she had chosen. But what disturbed her more than Thomas's arrogance was her own reaction to the letter. For just a moment, she had felt a traitorous flutter of longing for the world. He represented the world of theatre and literature, of intellectual conversation and social refinements. The world where she wouldn't have to prove herself worthy of basic respect, where her education would be valued rather than viewed with suspicion. She was still sitting in stunned silence when James and the boys returned for lunch, their faces flushed from the morning's ride. Tommy was chattering excitedly about a hawk they had seen, while Sam was full of questions about why cattle always seemed to know when weather was coming. "Clara?" James's voice cut through her confusion. "What's wrong?" She looked up to find him studying her with concern, his blue eyes taking in her pale face and trembling hands. The boys fell silent, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the room. Clara started, then stopped. How could she explain this? How could she tell him that her former fiancé had casually assumed she would abandon her new family for the promise of social status and financial security? James picked up the letter from the floor, his expression growing darker as he read. When he finished, he folded it carefully and set it on the table, his movements controlled but tense. "Boys," he said quietly, "why don't you go wash up for lunch?" Tommy and Sam exchanged glances but obeyed, clearly recognizing the adult conversation that was about to take place. When they were gone, James turned to Clara with an expression she couldn't read. "So," he said evenly, "Thomas Hartwell." Clara nodded miserably. "My former fiancé, the one who broke our engagement when my father lost his fortune. And now he wants you back." The simple statement hung between them, loaded with implications Clara wasn't sure she was ready to face. James wasn't asking if she wanted to go, was stating the fact that the option now existed. "James, I want you to know." "Do you want to go?" he interrupted, his voice carefully neutral. The question struck her like a physical blow. Do you want me to go? That's not what I asked. Clara stood up, pacing to the window where she could see the boys playing in the yard while they waited for lunch. They looked so settled, so happy. Tommy had been smiling more lately, and Sam had started calling her Mama without any hesitation. The three of them had become a real family, not just an arrangement of convenience. No, she said firmly, turning back to face him. I don't want to go back to Philadelphia. I don't want to go back to Thomas Hartwell or that life. But even as she said it, she could see doubt flicker in James's eyes. He had read the letter, had seen Thomas's assumptions about her unhappiness, his certainty that she would jump at the chance to return to civilized society. Clara, James said carefully, when we married, it was an arrangement born of necessity. You needed shelter, I needed help with the boys. But this, he gestured toward the letter, this is an offer of everything you gave up when you came west. Security, social position, a return to the world you were born to. The world I was born to cast me aside the moment I became inconvenient, Clara said, anger flaring in her chest. Thomas Hartwell made it very clear 5 years ago that I wasn't worth the risk to his precious career. Now that his circumstances have changed, he thinks he can simply reclaim me like a piece of property he decided he wants back. But you did love him once, James said quietly. The statement was like a knife between her ribs. She had loved Thomas, or thought she had. He had been everything a young woman of her class was supposed to want: handsome, ambitious, well-connected. She had been flattered by his attention, excited by the prospect of being a lawyer's wife in Philadelphia society. I loved who I thought he was, Clara said slowly. But when my family faced ruin, I learned who he really was. A man who valued appearances more than loyalty, who saw marriage as a business transaction rather than a partnership. James studied her face, searching for something she wasn't sure she knew how to show him. And what do you see marriage as now? The question caught her off guard. What did she see their marriage as? It had started as exactly what Thomas accused it, of being a practical arrangement between two desperate people. But somewhere along the way, it had become something more. I see it as, Clara paused, struggling for words, as two people choosing to build something together, choosing to care for each other and face whatever comes as a team. It's not about passion or romance or social advantage. It's about... She stopped, realizing what she was about to say. About what? James prompted gently. About love, she finished quietly. Not the kind poets write about, but the kind that grows from shared purpose and mutual respect, and caring about someone else's happiness as much as your own. The words hung between them, more honest than anything either of them had said since their wedding day. Clara felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she had revealed too much of her heart. James was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. The boys would be devastated if you left. It wasn't a declaration of his own feelings, but Clara heard something in his voice that gave her hope. And what about you? She asked softly. Would you be devastated? Before James could answer, the kitchen door burst open, and Tommy and Sam tumbled in, their brief patience with adult conversation exhausted. We're hungry, Sam announced. And Tommy says you look sad, Mama Clara. Why are you sad? Clara knelt down to their level, pulling both boys close. I'm not sad, sweetheart. Someone I used to know wrote me a letter, and it surprised me, that's all. Was it a bad letter? Tommy asked, with the perception that often caught adults off guard. Clara glanced at James over the boys' heads. It was a letter from someone who wanted me to go away from here, away from you and Sam and Papa. Both boys' faces filled with alarm. You're not going, are you? Sam asked, his voice small and frightened. No, Clara said firmly, hugging them tighter. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now. You're my family. The relief on their faces was so profound that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. These children had already lost one mother. The thought of losing another was clearly terrifying to them. Promise? Tommy asked, holding up his pinky finger in the way children did to seal the most important agreements. Promise, Clara said, linking her pinky with his and then with Sam's. That evening, after the boys were in bed, Clara found James in his study, staring into the fire. The letter from Thomas lay on his desk, a reminder of the choice she had made. "I meant what I said today," she told him. "I'm not going back to Philadelphia." James looked up at her, his expression serious. "Even though it would give you everything you lost, social position, financial security, a place in the world you understand." "The world I understand is here now," Clara said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "It's morning lessons with the boys and Sunday dinners and worrying about rustlers and being part of something that matters." "You could have children of your own with Hartwell," James said quietly. "A real family instead of this arrangement we've made." The words stung, even though Clara knew he didn't mean them to. "James, Tommy and Sam are real to me. What we've built here is real. It may not have started with love, but it's grown into something that feels more genuine than anything I ever had in Philadelphia." James studied her face in the firelight. "And if I said I wanted you to stay, not just for the boys' sake, but for mine?" Clara's breath caught. "Is that what you're saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere along the way, this arrangement stopped being convenient and started being necessary, not just practically, but emotionally. I'm saying that the thought of you leaving made me realize how much I've come to depend on having you here, not just as a mother to my sons, but as my partner." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was more than Clara had dared hope for. James was not a man given to flowery speeches or romantic gestures. For him to admit that he needed her was significant. "Then, I'll write to Thomas tomorrow," Clara said. "I'll tell him that I'm exactly where I belong." James nodded, relief evident in his expression. "What will you tell him?" Clara picked up the letter, reading Thomas's arrogant assumptions one more time. "I'll tell him that he's right about one thing. I have found my place in the world. It's just not the place he thinks I should want." The next morning, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a piece of plain writing paper, composing her response to Thomas Hartwell. The words came more easily than she had expected. "Thomas," she began, deliberately omitting any endearment, "I received your letter and find myself amazed by your presumptions. You assume I am unhappy, trapped, in need of rescue from a life I have chosen freely. You could not be more wrong. I am exactly where I belong, with a man who values my strength rather than tolerating my weaknesses, with children who need me not for my social connections, but for my love and care. My marriage is not a trap to be escaped, but a partnership I treasure. Please do not contact me again. The woman you once knew no longer exists, and the woman I have become has no place in your world. Clara Whitmore." As she sealed the letter, Clara felt a profound sense of closure. Thomas Hartwell and the life he represented belonged to her past. Her future was here, in this house, with this family she had chosen, and who had chosen her in return. She was no longer the desperate woman who had arrived in a blizzard with nothing but a worn leather satchel. She was Clara Whitmore, wife and mother, a woman who had found her strength in the most unlikely circumstances, and was finally, truly home. The confrontation Clara had been dreading came 3 weeks after she sent her rejection letter to Thomas Hartwell. She was in the garden behind the house, teaching the boys to identify the early spring plants that Elizabeth had once tended, when the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed made her look up with alarm. James was in the north pasture with most of the ranch hands, checking for signs of more rustling activity. The few men left behind were scattered across the property on various tasks. Clara realized with a sinking heart that she and the boys were essentially alone. 6 riders crested the hill that led to the house, and Clara immediately recognized the danger in their approach. These weren't neighbors or business associates, these men rode with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to taking what they wanted through intimidation and force. "Boys," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying the authority that had served her well in the schoolroom, "go into the house, now. Go to your father's study and lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Tommy, now 9 and increasingly aware of the adult world's dangers, immediately grasped the seriousness of the situation. "Mama Clara, come with us. I need to talk to these men," Clara said, her hand moving instinctively to the pocket of her apron, where she kept James's father's derringer precaution James had insisted upon after the rustling incident. "Go. Take care of your brother." The boys reluctantly obeyed, though Clara could see Tommy's face in the window of the study as the riders approached. She straightened her spine and walked to meet them in the front yard, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her determination to protect her family stronger than her fear. The leader of the group was a well-dressed man in his 40s, with the soft look of someone who paid others to do his dangerous work. His pale eyes assessed Clara with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume," he said, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy. "Marcus Webb, at your service. I believe your husband and I have some unfinished business to discuss." Clara had heard enough about Webb to know that his presence here, with James away, was no coincidence. "Mr. Whitmore is not at home," she said coolly. "Perhaps you could return at a more convenient time." Webb's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Oh, I think this time is quite convenient indeed. You see, Mrs. Whitmore, I've been having a devil of a time convincing your husband to see reason about selling his land. Perhaps a woman of your obvious refinement can help him understand the benefits of accepting my generous offer." "I'm sure my husband has made his position clear," Clara replied, her hand shifting closer to the derringer. "The ranch is not for sale." "Everything is for sale, my dear lady, at the right price. And sometimes that price isn't measured in dollars." Webb's meaning was unmistakably threatening, and Clara felt her heart rate accelerate. One of Webb's men, a rough-looking individual with scarred hands and cold eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, we could just take care of this problem right now. Make it look like rustlers got out of hand." Webb held up a hand. Now, Jenkins, let's not be hasty. I'm sure Mrs. Whitmore is a reasonable woman who understands the precarious nature of frontier life. Accidents happen so easily out here. Fires, stampedes, unfortunate encounters with desperate men." His eyes moved meaningfully toward the house, where he undoubtedly knew the boys were hiding. The threat was clear, and Clara felt rage replace fear in her chest. This man was threatening her children, her family, her home. The protective instincts that had been growing stronger every day since she became a mother flared to full life. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice deadly calm, "I suggest you and your men leave our property immediately." Webb laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Or what, my dear? You'll ask us politely to go? I think you fail to understand your situation. You're alone here with 2 small children, miles from help. Your husband is conveniently away, and my men are well. Let's say they're not known for their gentle treatment of obstacles." Clara's hand closed around the derringer, her mind racing. She was outnumbered 6-1, but she had advantages Webb didn't know about. James had been teaching her to shoot, and her natural steady hand had served her well. More importantly, she had spent months learning the layout of the ranch, including the locations of the hands who were working nearby. "You know," she said conversationally, taking a step back toward the house, "you've made one critical mistake, Mr. Webb. And what might that be? You assumed I was helpless." Clara's voice carried a new edge, and she saw Webb's confident expression falter slightly. "You assumed that because I'm a woman, I'd be easy to intimidate. You assumed wrong." With that, Clara pulled the derringer from her pocket and fired a shot into the air, not at the men, but as a signal. James had arranged with the hands that a gunshot from the house would bring immediate help, and Clara prayed they were close enough to hear it. The sharp crack of the small pistol caused the horses to shy and the men to reach for their weapons, but Clara was already moving. She had spent weeks studying the ranch's defensive positions under James's tutelage, and she knew exactly where to go. "The lady's got some spirit," Jenkins sneered, drawing his gun. "Too bad she's about to run out of luck." But before he could aim, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of James and 3 ranch hands, riding hard in response to Clara's signal. James took in the situation at a glance, his wife, facing down 6 armed men, the boys nowhere to be seen, but obviously hidden somewhere safe. "Webb," James said, his voice carrying deadly menace as he dismounted with his rifle in hand. "I should have expected you'd be coward enough to threaten women and children." Webb's confident demeanor cracked as he found himself facing 4 armed men who knew the terrain and had every reason to fight. "Now, Whitmore, let's be reasonable. I came here to make you a business proposition." With 6 armed men, James's rifle was now pointed directly at Webb's chest. "That's an interesting way to conduct business." Clara, still holding the derringer, moved to stand beside her husband. The unity of their position, 2 people prepared to fight together for their family, and home was not lost on Webb or his men. "This isn't over, Whitmore," Webb said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You can't watch your family every moment of every day." "Try me," James said simply, and something in his tone made Webb's horse sidestep nervously. For a moment, the tension stretched taut between the 2 groups. Clara could see the calculation in Webb's eyes. Was this the moment to force the issue, or should he retreat and try a different approach? The decision was made for him when Tommy's voice rang out from an upstairs window. "Mama Clara, Papa, Sheriff Johnson is coming up the road." All eyes turned to see the dust cloud approaching that announced the arrival of the county sheriff and 2 deputies. Webb's face went pale as he realized his threatening visit was about to become a matter of legal record. "This conversation isn't finished," Webb said, wheeling his horse around. "Yes, it is," Clara said firmly, surprising everyone, including herself, with the steel in her voice. "The next time you come onto our land, uninvited, Mr. Webb, I won't fire a warning shot." Webb's eyes met hers, and whatever he saw there made him urge his horse into a gallop. His men followed, leaving the Whitmore family standing, united in their front yard as Sheriff Johnson rode up. Later that evening, after the sheriff had taken their statements and the boys had been reassured that the danger was past, Clara found herself alone with James in his study. The ranch deed lay spread on his desk, the document that represented everything Webb wanted to take from them. "I've been thinking," James said quietly, "maybe we should consider Webb's offer. Not because I want to sell, but because I can't bear the thought of something happening to you or the boys because of my stubbornness." Clara looked at him with something approaching shock. "James Whitmore, are you suggesting we run away?" "I'm suggesting we protect what matters most." Clara moved to stand beside his chair, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. "What matters most is that we don't let men like Webb win. What matters most is that Tommy and Sam grow up knowing their father didn't back down from bullies. What matters most is that we fight for what's ours." James looked up at her, seeing something in her face that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived at his door in desperation. "When did you become so fierce?" "When I found something worth fighting for," Clara said simply. James reached up to cover her hand with his, and Clara felt the calluses on his palm from years of hard work, the strength that had built everything Webb wanted to steal. "We'll face this together," James said. "Together," Clara agreed, and for the first time since their practical wedding, the word felt like a promise of something deeper than mere partnership. The ranch deed remained spread on the desk between them, but Clara no longer saw it as just a legal document. It was the foundation of their family's future, the legacy they would pass to Tommy and Sam, the symbol of everything they had chosen to build together. Whatever came next, they would meet it as they had met Webb's threat, standing side by side, protecting what mattered most. Clara touched the spot where her mother's locket rested against her throat, drawing strength from the knowledge that courage and determination ran in her blood. She was ready for whatever battles lay ahead. The final confrontation came at dawn 3 days later, when Clara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast and heard the unmistakable sound of cattle being driven hard across the range. She looked out the window to see a cloud of dust rising from the direction of their main herd, and her blood ran cold. James was already running from the barn, shouting orders to the hands who were scrambling to saddle their horses. But Clara could see from the kitchen window what he couldn't. From ground level there were too many riders scattered across the range, too organized to be ordinary rustlers. This was Webb's final gambit, a coordinated attack designed to steal enough cattle to ruin them financially and send a message to other ranchers who might resist his offers. Clara's mind raced as she assessed the situation, her teacher's instincts for managing chaos kicking in. The boys were still asleep upstairs, which was a blessing. But James and his men were about to ride into what looked like a carefully planned ambush, and Clara realized she might be the only one positioned to see the full scope of Webb's strategy. She made her decision in seconds, grabbing the field glasses from James's study and racing up to the attic, where she could get the best view of the entire range. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Webb's men had split their forces, with one group driving the cattle, while another lay in wait to ambush anyone who came after them. Clara burst out of the house, just as James was mounting his horse. "James, wait!" she called. "It's a trap!" He wheeled his horse around, his face grim. "What do you mean?" "There are men waiting in the rocks above Miller's Creek," Clara said breathlessly. "If you ride straight after the cattle, you'll be caught in crossfire between two groups." James's expression went deadly serious. "Are you certain?" "I saw them through your field glasses. They're positioned to cut off any retreat." One of the ranch hands, Bill Hayes, rode up at that moment. "Boss, we're losing time. If we don't move now." "We move smart, not fast." James cut him off. He looked at Clara with a mixture of admiration and concern. "How many men did you count?" "At least 12, maybe more. Too many for a direct assault." James was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then his expression cleared, with the look of a man who had made a difficult decision. "Bill, take half the men and circle around to the north. Come at them from the high ground. I'll take the others and create a distraction from the south." "And if they have more men than we thought?" Bill asked. "Then we improvise." James looked at Clara again. "Can you keep watching from the house? Signal us if you see reinforcements coming?" Clara nodded, then surprised herself by reaching up to touch his hand. "Be careful. The boys need their father." Something flickered in James's eyes at her words' warmth, gratitude, and something deeper that made her heart skip. "And I need to come back to my wife," he said quietly. As the men rode out, Clara positioned herself in the attic with the field glasses, watching the complex dance of strategy and counter-strategy play out across the range. She could see James's group taking position in the rocks below the creek, while Bill's men made their way carefully around the northern ridge. But what worried her most was movement she spotted on the eastern approach, more riders, heading toward the ranch house itself. Webb wasn't just after the cattle, he was planning to take hostages to force James's surrender. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the pocket where she kept the derringer, but she knew one small pistol wouldn't be enough against multiple attackers. She needed to be smarter than that. Racing downstairs, she woke the boys as gently as she could. "Tommy, Sam, I need you to get dressed quickly and quietly. We're going to play a hiding game." Tommy, now old enough to read the tension in her voice, was instantly alert. "Is there danger, Mama Clara?" "There might be. I need you to take Sam to the root cellar and stay there until Papa or I come to get you. No matter what you hear, don't come out unless you hear one of us call your name 3 times. Do you understand?" Both boys nodded solemnly, and Clara's heart ached at how quickly they had learned to trust her judgment in dangerous situations. She helped them gather blankets and water, then led them to the hidden cellar entrance in the kitchen pantry. "Mama Clara," Sam whispered as she settled them into their hiding place, "are you going to be safe?" "I'm going to do everything I can to keep us all safe," Clara promised, kissing both boys' foreheads. "Remember 3 times. Don't come out for anything else." As she secured the cellar entrance, Clara heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the kitchen window, she could see 4 riders heading directly for the house. Her heart pounded as she recognized one of them, Jenkins, the scarred man who had threatened her during Webb's first visit. Clara's mind raced through her options. She could try to run, but she wouldn't get far on foot. She could barricade herself in the house, but that would only delay the inevitable. Or she could meet them head-on and try to convince them she was more valuable as a bargaining chip than as a victim. The third option terrified her, but it was the only one that might protect the boys and buy James time to deal with the ambush at the cattle pens. Taking a deep breath, Clara checked her derringer one more time, then walked out onto the front porch to meet Webb's men. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Gentlemen," she said with icy politeness, "you're trespassing on private property." Jenkins laughed as he dismounted. Well, the schoolmarm wants to play tough. That's real entertaining, lady, but we're here on business." "What kind of business?" "The kind where you come with us real peaceful. And maybe your husband and his boys don't end up shot full of holes." Jenkins' smile was ugly and confident. "See, Mr. Webb figured Whitmore might be stubborn about giving up his cattle, but he'll be real reasonable when it comes to getting his pretty wife back." Clara felt ice form in her stomach, but she kept her expression calm. "And if I refuse? Then things get unpleasant for everyone." One of the other men spoke up, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. "Starting with those boys of yours. We know they're in the house." The threat to Tommy and Sam ignited something fierce and protective in Clara's chest. These men had made a critical error. They had threatened her children. "You're absolutely right," Clara said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge that made Jenkins's confidence falter slightly. "I should come with you, but first, let me get my things." Jenkins nodded, clearly pleased that his intimidation had worked so easily. "Smart woman. Make it quick." Clara turned to go back into the house, her hand closing around the derringer in her pocket. As she reached the doorway, she spun around and fired, not at the men but at the rope that held the ranch bell beside the porch. The bell crashed to the ground with a thunderous clang that echoed across the range, a sound every ranch hand would recognize as the emergency signal. But more importantly, it was a sound that would carry to James and tell him exactly where the real danger lay. "You little," Jenkins started, reaching for his gun, but Clara was already diving behind the porch railing as shots erupted around her. For the next few minutes, Clara found herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse, using every bit of cover the ranch house provided, while the four men tried to flush her out without killing her outright. They needed her alive for their plan to work, which was the only advantage she had. But she could hear them getting closer, and she knew her small pistol wouldn't hold them off much longer. Just as Jenkins rounded the corner of the house with his gun drawn, Clara heard the most beautiful sound in the world, James's voice, loud and commanding. "Drop your weapons now." James and two of his men had circled back at the sound of the bell, and now they had Webb's men caught in the open with nowhere to run. The standoff lasted only seconds before Jenkins threw down his gun with a curse. As James secured the prisoners, Clara emerged from her hiding place, shaking with reaction but unharmed. The moment James saw her, he crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when I heard that bell I thought—" "I'm all right," Clara said, but she was clinging to him as tightly as he was holding her. "The boys are safe in the cellar, but James, what about the cattle, the ambush?" "Bill's men got the drop on them from the high ground. We recovered most of the herd." James pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "You saved us all with that signal. If we'd stayed focused on the cattle while they took you—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara could see the fear in his eyes at what might have happened. "We're all safe," she said firmly. "That's what matters." But even as she said it, Clara knew this confrontation had changed something fundamental between them. The crisis had stripped away the last pretenses of their practical arrangement, revealing the depth of feeling that had grown beneath the surface. They stood there in the morning sunlight, holding each other while the ranch hands secured Webb's men and the boys remained safely hidden in the cellar, and Clara realized that somewhere along the way, their marriage of convenience had become something much more précieux, partnership forged in trust, tested by danger, and strengthened by the knowledge that they would fight for each other and their family against any threat. The derringer in her pocket had become a symbol of her transformation from helpless victim to fierce protector. Clara Whitmore was no longer the desperate woman who had arrived in a blizzard. She was a woman who would defend her home and family with everything she had, and who had found in that defense the final piece of herself she had been missing all along. The aftermath of Webb's failed attack brought changes to the Whitmore ranch that no one could have anticipated. With Webb's men in custody and facing federal charges for cattle rustling and attempted kidnapping, the immediate threat was over. But the crisis had shattered the careful emotional boundaries that James and Clara had maintained since their wedding day. That evening, after Sheriff Johnson had taken the prisoners to town and the boys had been reassured that the danger was truly past, Clara found herself alone with James in the parlor. The house felt different, somehow more like a fortress they had defended together than simply a place where they lived by arrangement. "I need to say something," James began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair, in the gesture Clara had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort with emotional conversations. "What is it?" Clara asked gently, settling into the chair across from his. "What you did today, standing up to those men, protecting the boys, thinking quickly enough to signal for help." James paused, searching for words. Elizabeth could never have done that. She was a gentle soul, refined, delicate. She would have been terrified. Clara felt a familiar pang at the comparison to his first wife, but this time it carried a different weight. "Everyone responds to danger differently," she said carefully. "That's not what I mean." James leaned forward, his blue eyes intense in the lamplight. "What I mean is that I've been comparing you to Elizabeth, and that was unfair to both of you. She was perfect for the man I was, before someone who needed to be protected, cared for, sheltered from the harsh realities of frontier life. But the man I am now, the father my boys need me to be, I need a partner who can stand beside me when things get dangerous. I need someone like you." The words hung between them, carrying implications that made Clara's heart race. "James, I'm not finished," he said quietly. "I also need to tell you that somewhere along the way, this arrangement we made stopped being about convenience or necessity, at least for me." Clara's breath caught. "What are you saying?" James stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch that had nearly been stolen from them that day. "I'm saying that when I heard that bell ring and realized you were in danger, I felt something I hadn't felt since Elizabeth died. Terror at the thought of losing someone." He stopped, his shoulders tense. "Someone you what?" Clara prompted softly. James turned to face her, and in his expression she saw all the vulnerability he usually kept so carefully hidden. "Someone I love," he said simply. The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Clara thought she understood about their relationship. She stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. "You love me?" she whispered. "I love you," James confirmed, his voice gaining strength. "Not the way I loved Elizabeth. That was the love of youth, uncomplicated and untested. This is different. This is the love of a man who has learned what truly matters, who has found a woman strong enough to be his true partner in everything life brings." Clara rose from her chair on unsteady legs, her heart pounding so hard she was sure James could hear it. "I love you too," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I have for weeks now, but I didn't dare hope you could feel the same way about me." The distance between them disappeared as James crossed to her, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "How could I not love you? You saved my sons from their grief. You brought laughter and learning back into this house. And today you proved you'd risk everything to protect our family." "Our family," Clara repeated, savoring the words. "Our family," James confirmed, and then he was kissing her with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara rested her forehead against James's chest. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we stop pretending this is just a practical arrangement," James said, his arms tightening around her. "Now we acknowledge that we're truly married, in every sense of the word." Clara pulled back to look at him, seeing her own joy reflected in his eyes. "The boys will be so happy. They've been hoping." "They've been hoping what?" "That you would fall in love with me the way they have. Clara said with a smile. Tommy asked me just last week if I thought you might want to marry me for real someday. James laughed, the sound rich and warm. Out of the mouths of babes, they saw what we were too stubborn to admit. The next morning brought a scene that would remain etched in Clara's memory forever. The boys came down to breakfast to find their parents sitting closer together than usual, sharing quiet smiles and meaningful glances. "Did something happen?" Tommy asked, with the perceptiveness that never failed to surprise Clara. "Something wonderful happened," James said, reaching across the table to take Clara's hand. "Your mama and I realize that we love each other very much." Sam's face lit up like the sun. "Does that mean you're married for real now, like in the stories?" "We were always married for real," Clara said gently, "but now we're married with our hearts as well as with the law." Tommy, ever practical despite his youth, had a more pressing concern. "Does this mean we can have a real wedding, with cake and dancing and everyone from town?" James and Clara exchanged glances. Their first wedding had been a hasty affair, born of necessity. The idea of celebrating their love publicly, of affirming their commitment before the community that had watched their relationship with such interest, held tremendous appeal. "Would you like that?" Clara asked. "A real wedding celebration?" "Oh yes," both boys said in unison, their excitement infectious. That afternoon, while the boys played outside and James worked in his study, Clara found herself in Elizabeth's sewing room, but now she thought of it simply as the sewing room, a space that belonged to their family's present rather than its past. She was working on the final touches of Tommy's shirt, the one Elizabeth had started years ago, when she discovered something that made her breath catch. Tucked inside Elizabeth's work basket, beneath scraps of fabric and spools of thread, was a small leather journal. Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she should intrude on such private thoughts. But curiosity won, and she opened the journal to find Elizabeth's delicate handwriting covering the pages, not diary entries, but letters. Letters addressed to the sons she would never see grow up. "My dearest Tommy," one entry began, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and my heart breaks to think of you facing the world without your mama. But I want you to know that every moment I carried you, every day I held you in my arms, was a gift beyond measure. You are going to grow into a fine man, strong and kind like your papa, and I will be watching over you always." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she read page after page of a mother's love and wisdom, written in the shadow of an uncertain future. Elizabeth had known the dangers of childbirth on the frontier, and she had prepared as best she could for the possibility that she might not survive. But it was the final entry that took Clara's breath away completely. "To the woman who will love my family after I am gone," it began. "I do not know who you will be or how you will come into their lives, but I know you will exist, because James deserves love and my boys deserve a mother's care. Please do not think of yourself as my replacement. You cannot replace me, nor should you try. You will be something different and equally precious, the woman who helps them heal, who brings new joy into their lives, who loves them not because you have to, but because you choose to. Love them well, and know that I am grateful to you across whatever distance separates us. Help James remember that his heart is big enough for both old love and new. Help my boys understand that loving you does not mean forgetting me. And please, if you ever doubt your place in this family, remember this. You were always meant to find them, and they were always meant to find you. With gratitude and blessing, Elizabeth Whitmore." Clara sank into Elizabeth's chair, clutching the journal to her chest as tears streamed down her face. All these months, she had felt like an intruder in Elizabeth's life, a poor substitute trying to fill shoes that were too big for her. But Elizabeth herself had understood that love wasn't a finite resource, that a family's capacity for love could expand to include new people without diminishing what had come before. "Clara?" James's voice came from the doorway, filled with concern. "What's wrong?" Clara looked up at him through her tears, holding out the journal. "She knew," she said wonderingly. "She knew someone like me would come, and Shesh gave us her blessing." James took the journal with trembling hands, reading the passages Clara showed him. When he finished, his own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She always was wiser than I gave her credit for," he said softly. "Even at the end, she was trying to take care of us." "She was right about everything," Clara said. "About love being big enough for both past and present, about my place in this family. I've been so worried about living up to her memory, but she wasn't asking me to be her. She was asking me to be myself." James sat down beside Clara in the chair that had once belonged to his first wife, pulling her close. "And you've been perfectly yourself from the day you arrived. Strong where she was gentle, practical where she was romantic, fierce where she was delicate. The boys needed exactly who you are, Clara. I needed exactly who you are." That evening, James gathered the family around the old Bible that had belonged to his grandmother, the one that recorded births and deaths and marriages, going back 4 generations. As Clara watched, he carefully wrote their names and wedding date in the family record, but this time he added something that hadn't been there before: renewed with love, and the current date. "What are you doing, Papa?" Sam asked, leaning against James's shoulder to watch. "I'm recording the day your mama and I promised to love each other forever," James explained. "Not just as a practical arrangement, but as a true marriage." Tommy studied the page seriously. "So now it's official. You're really and truly married." "Really and truly," Clara confirmed, her heart full to overflowing. As they sat together in the lamplight, the Bible open before them, and Elizabeth's journal resting nearby, Clara felt the final pieces of her new life settle into place. She was no longer the desperate woman who had arrived in a blizzard, nor was she trying to be the ghost of James's first wife. She was Clara Whitmore, fully and completely herself, wife and mother and partner, in every sense of the word. The family Bible would record their real marriage date for future generations to see, but Clara knew the true transformation had been happening gradually, day by day, choice by choice, as they had learned to love each other, not out of necessity, but out of recognition of something precious and rare. Outside, the Montana wind whispered across the range they had fought to defend, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. Inside, a family sat together in the warm glow of lamplight, bound together by love that had grown from the most unlikely soil into something strong enough to weather any storm. Clara touched the family Bible gently, thinking of all the names recorded there, all the lives that had led to this moment. Soon, she hoped, there would be new names to add, children who would grow up knowing from the beginning that they were wanted and loved, that they belonged to a family built on choice and commitment rather than mere chance. But for now, it was enough to sit here with James's arm around her and the boys leaning against them both, to know that she had found her place in the world at last. She was home, truly and completely home, and nothing would ever change that again. 3 months later, on a perfect June morning, Clara stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the simple white dress she had sewn for the occasion. It wasn't elaboratees, was no longer a young bride having her first wedding, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, with delicate embroidery around the neckline that she had worked on during the quiet evening hours. Today marked their official wedding celebration, the public ceremony that would announce to the entire community that James and Clara Whitmore were not just married by law and convenience, but by choice and love. The whole town would be there, along with ranchers from across the territory, who had come to witness what had become something of a frontier legend, the practical marriage that had blossomed into a great love story. A soft knock at the door interrupted her preparations. "Come in," she called, expecting to find one of the boys. Instead, Margaret Fairfax entered, carrying a small wrapped package. The banker's wife looked uncharacteristically humble, her usual sharp confidence replaced by something that might have been shame. "Mrs. Whitmore Clares, hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony." Clara turned from the mirror, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Of course, Mrs. Fairfax. Please sit down." Margaret perched on the edge of the chair, clutching her package. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "Several apologies, actually. I was cruel to you when you first married James, and I justified it by telling myself I was protecting Elizabeth's memory. But the truth is, I was protecting my own feelings. Clara sat down across from her, intrigued despite herself. Your own feelings? Elizabeth and I were very close friends. When she died, I felt like I had lost a sister, and I suppose— Margaret paused, struggling with the admission. I suppose I felt like if James could love someone else, it somehow diminished what he had felt for her, as if love were a finite resource that could be used up. I understand that fear, Clara said gently. I felt it too for a long time. Margaret looked up, surprise in her eyes. You did? I was terrified that I could never measure up to Elizabeth's memory, that I would always be second best in James's heart and in his son's affections. It took me months to understand that love doesn't work that way, that James's love for Elizabeth doesn't make his love for me any less real, and that the boys' love for their first mother doesn't diminish their love for me. How did you come to understand that? Margaret asked. Clara smiled, thinking of Elizabeth's journal and the wisdom contained in its pages. Elizabeth herself taught me, in a way. She left behind words that helped me realize I wasn't competing with her memory, I was adding to the family's capacity for love. Margaret was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she held out the package. I brought this for you. It belonged to Elizabeth, but I think she would have wanted you to have it. Clara unwrapped the gift carefully, gasping when she saw what lay inside. It was a delicate silver locket, much finer than her mother's simple gold one, engraved with tiny flowers and obviously crafted by a master jeweler. It was Elizabeth's wedding locket, Margaret explained. James gave it to her on their wedding day. After she died, he asked me to keep it safe, said he couldn't bear to see it but couldn't bear to get rid of it either. But I think she would want it to be worn again, by the woman who has brought so much happiness back into her family's life. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she held the precious locket. Margaret, I can't take this. It's too— Please, Margaret interrupted. Let me do this one thing right. I've watched you these past months, watched how you've cared for those boys, how you've stood by James through danger, how you've made that house a home again. Elizabeth would have loved you, Clara. She would have been grateful to you. Please let me give you this on her behalf. Clara opened the locket to find a tiny photograph of Elizabeth holding baby Tommy, both of them glowing with happiness. On the other side was an engraving. Love multiplies when shared. She chose that engraving herself, Margaret said softly. She said she wanted to remember that love wasn't something to be hoarded, but something to be given freely. Clara fastened the locket around her neck, where it settled next to her mother's simpler one. Two women, two generations, two different kinds of love, all connected by the silver and gold chains that bound past to present. Thank you, Clara said, embracing Margaret impulsively. This means more to me than you know. When Margaret left, Clara stood before the mirror again, touching both lockets gently. She looked different now than she had 8 months ago, when she had first arrived at the Whitmore ranch in desperation. The frightened, uncertain woman was gone, replaced by someone confident in her place in the world, secure in her family's love. A commotion outside drew her to the window. The entire front yard was filled with Peoply neighbors and friends, ranchers and townspeople, all gathered to celebrate the love that had grown from such practical beginnings. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the area, and someone had strung lanterns between the trees for the dancing that would follow the ceremony. Tommy and Sam were racing between the guests in their best clothes, their faces bright with excitement. They had appointed themselves official greeters, and Clara could see them proudly telling anyone who would listen about their real wedding and how their parents had fallen in love, just like in the fairy tales. James stood near the makeshift altar that had been erected in the garden, looking handsome in his best suit and speaking quietly with Reverend Morrison. When he looked up and saw Clara in the window, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip, just as it had the first time she had seen it. A soft knock at her door announced the arrival of her escorts, Tommy and Sam, both grinning widely and clearly taking their responsibilities seriously. "Mama Clara," Tommy said with 9-year-old solemnity. "We're supposed to walk you down to Papa now." "Are you ready?" Sam asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Clara took one last look in the mirror, seeing not a desperate spinster or a poor substitute for another woman, but Clara Whitmore, wife, mother, and full partner in a family built on love and choice. She was ready. The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted in the garden where Clara had first begun to feel at home on the ranch. As she walked down the makeshift aisle between the gathered guests, her arms linked with her son's, Clara felt the warmth of community acceptance and approval that had been so long in coming. James's eyes never left her face as she approached, and when she reached his side, he took her hands with a reverence that made several of the watching women dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, "we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate the renewal of vows between James and Clara Whitmore, a couple who have shown us all that the strongest marriages are built not just on passion, but on partnership, not just on romance, but on respect and commitment that deepens with time." The vows they exchanged were their own, written in the quiet evenings after the boys had gone to bed. James promised to love Clara, not just for who she was, but for who she was becoming, to be her partner in all things, and to cherish the gift of a love that had grown slowly and surely from the most unlikely soil. Clara promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges lay ahead, to love his sons as her own, and to build with him a future worthy of the past they both honored. When James slipped a new ring onto her finger, a beautiful band that complemented the simple gold one from their first ceremony, Clara felt the final pieces of her transformation lock into place. She was no longer becoming Clara Whitmore. She simply was Clara Whitmore, completely and irrevocably. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Morrison said with a smile, again. The kiss they shared was witnessed by the entire community, but to Clara it felt as intimate as if they were alone. It was a kiss that sealed not just their renewed vows, but their journey from strangers brought together by necessity to partners bound by love. As the celebration continued into the evening, with dancing and laughter and the kind of joy that comes from watching love triumph over adversity, Clara found herself sitting on the porch steps with the new family portrait they had commissioned from a traveling photographer. The image showed all four of them, James and Clara, seated, with Tommy and Sam standing behind them, all of them smiling with genuine happiness. It would take its place on the mantel beside Elizabeth's portrait, not as a replacement, but as a continuation of the family's story. "Mama Clara," Sam said, settling beside her on the steps, "are you happy?" Clara looked out at the scene before her husband, dancing with Margaret Fairfax, as a gesture of forgiveness and new friendship, Tommy teaching the younger children a game he had learned in school, neighbors and friends celebrating under the Montana stars. She thought of the desperate woman who had knocked on this door with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a prayer, and marveled at how far they had all come. "I'm very happy, sweetheart," she said, pulling Sam close. "Are you?" "The happiest," Sam declared with the certainty of childhood. "We're a real family now." "We were always a real family," Clara corrected gently. "From the very first day I arrived. We just needed time to realize it." As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift toward home, Clara stood with James on the porch of the house that had become her sanctuary, watching the last of the lanterns flicker in the trees. The new family portrait rested against her lap, but her eyes were on the future, spread out before Thema. Future they would build together, choice by choice, day by day. The desperate spinster who had arrived in a blizzard was gone forever, transformed into a woman who had found her strength, her purpose, and her place in the world. Clara Whitmore was home at last, surrounded by the love she had never dared dream possible, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead for the family they had chosen to become. Sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never planned for, the ones that found you when you were brave enough to say yes to an impossible proposition offered by a stranger in the middle of a storm. Clara touched both lockets at her throw, their mother's gold and Elizabeth's silver, and smiled, knowing that love, like hope, was indeed something that multiplied when shared. The Montana wind whispered across the range, carrying with it the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come.